Yeah, you sound it's very crystal clear. It's sounding crisp. So
Okay, good, 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 good.
awesome. So I have many questions that I've written for both of us for us to talk about this, but I feel like I'm coming into your audience. Is it okay if I introduce myself just a little bit so
Oh,
they know who I
absolutely,
am? Okay,
absolutely.
perfect, perfect. Well, my name is
Because if
Ciarra
you're not
Jones.
following her, you should be following her. Period.
Well, I think your work is so brilliant. I'm excited for us to chat today. And just to introduce myself to your audience, my name is Ciarra. TikTok, I go by the Gardening Theologian. Like Donnell, I have my master's in theology. I think yours is in divinity. Is that correct, Donnell?
It's in religious studies.
Religious studies. Okay, got it. So I'm a
Yeah.
master's in theological studies, very, very similar disciplines.
Hmm.
And essentially, my work has focused on religion, gender, and sexuality. And so thinking about reinterpreting biblical text that's been deep, or passages that have been deep LGBTQ inclusion in the church. I also do have a background in African American religious studies as well.
Hmm.
But excited to be here. And I think similarly to you, I grew up Assemblies of God. And so I have a lot of thoughts about this documentary.
Yeah, I grew up Apostolic Pentecostal. So I got
Okay.
a question already. What are we talking about? We're talking about the Hillsong documentary. It is called The Secrets of Hillsong.
Yes,
Yeah,
the Secrets of Hillsong, something
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
something to that effect. So we're talking about that, and we're going to be unpacking all the things that because we already had a pre-conversation, and we both couldn't get off the call because we were just bouncing ideas and going back and forth. So if you don't follow Ciarra, please make sure that you give her a follow. She's one of my favorite follows on here. So
Oh, well, thank you.
um,
That's how I feel about you. Oh my gosh, I love your content.
thank you,
And
thank you.
I have a question for you. Can I come out the gate with a question?
Of course, of
All
course.
right, let's do it. Let's do it. So something that we talked about a bit, and I want to set the scene for this because if folks don't have a framework for that kind of 2000s to 2015 time, it's hard to really understand what was happening in churches at that time. And so I wonder if we could talk about like Hillsong, their religious origins, like with Assemblies of God, and how they kind of packaged church to be liberal and exciting, to seem liberal and exciting at this time. So I just want to hear your perspective of like this time frame and what was happening kind of as a trend within churches around like Assemblies of God, Hillsong, and all that.
So I mean, as far as I know that like Brian Houston when he because I think his church is Pentecostal. The original church that he planted in Australia was is Pentecostal, and so what the documentary reveals is that in the '80s, or I think either '80s or '90s, he came to America, and he learned from a lot of the televangelists that were a part of just kind of like popular discourse in America, who were like on television, who were doing prosperity gospel stuff. So he came to America, and like left with field notes and went back to his
Mm,
congregation and said, "This is what we're going to do. We're going to apply a lot of these things." That's when Brian Houston started teaching about money. That's one of the first books he wrote is "You Need More Money." So there's this really, I think there's this surge in just like the merger of like capitalism and evangelicalism and like just the church, in which
mm-hmm.
like it became like a money making machine, and people found out the way to expand is to try to get as much money as possible, get as much funding as possible, make your services as kind of open and inclusive as possible. Um, and but I think what Hillsong did really well when they started to plant churches in America, or not really did really well, but one of the strategies was that they didn't talk about divisive things.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a part of the culture. Like you come in, like I know from my personal experience being a part of a Hillsong church, is that we weren't allowed to talk about politics or race or any kind of divisive, what was called quote unquote divisive topics. And so the life groups or whatever meetings we were having was really focused on just the Bible and like what we can learn from the Bible and how it can apply to our lives. But it was missing so much of that intersectional like dialogue about the intersections of race and religion, the intersections of
Mm,
gender and sexuality and religion.
mm.
So that was the model that they used, right? To get the goal is to get as many people in the door as possible, to get them invested,
Yes.
to get them excited, right? And to get them to spend their money, to donate their money. Um,
Yes.
mhm.
No, yes, the excitement is so I think it was interesting for me, like, right, being in like the parent denomination of Assemblies of God, like Assemblies of God sermons and preachers are very clear about their politics. Like, I think it was always very clear to me growing up in my church that it was deeply conservative. that there was some aspects of colonial theology, there was some racism in theology. My pastors would say kind of pretty homophobic things from the pulpit. But then I would go to like the non-denominational branches of these churches. Like in San Francisco, they had Reality SF, which wasn't a Hillsong church, but I think operated very similarly.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was a way that they, I saw a lot of queer people in that church. And I would talk to queer people about their experience, and they would say, well, like, no one said anything homophobic to me. The theology doesn't seem homophobic, but it still was. They did something to like kind of hide their true politics underneath. And so I don't know. I thought that was really fascinating, like just being from a church that was more clear about its politics and then
Oh
going into
yeah.
Hillsong churches. And it was so hidden under the smoke and the fire and the lights and all that stuff, you know?
No, and that's literally what drove a lot of people to go. Like you talk, like I was one of those people. Like when I watched
Mm,
both documentaries, both this one, The Secrets of Hillsong, and the one before this, which was called Hillsong, a Mega Church Exposed, which was on Discovery Plus.
mm,
Um, in both documentaries, you got these testimonies from people who came from really conservative spaces and were going into um, this new kind of exciting, seemingly refreshing thing.
mm-hmm.
But they just realized that, as they stayed there, some of them as they grew in leadership, that it was a lot of the same stuff, but just, hidden and covert. Um,
Mm,
so I was one of those people. I came from a very rigid, like it was, fire and brimstone. It was very clear about gender and sexuality. It was very clear about like all these different doctrines that they had. Like I didn't have to question, like, what do we believe about this? Like it was
yeah,
very clear.
yeah,
So the way that they just kind of removed any fire and brimstone conversations, the way that they just removed any like kind of anything that would be divisive, or they really kept it to a level where for me I didn't realize how much of that conservatism was hidden behind the smoke
mm,
and mirrors until I kind of got behind it, until I started to rise in leadership and started to
yeah,
have conversations with people in leadership and started to hear some of the same conservative theologies. But I was like, we're not talking about this in the pulpit. And so what would happen is that
yes.
people would be confused. They would come to, like, youth leaders would come and be like, okay, this kid is trying to talk about sexuality, and like we don't really
Mm,
have a stance on that. What are we doing? And like, what should we tell the kids? And that's
mm.
when we started to see like the Pentecostal roots of of a lot of the those Hillsong mega churches.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like you said, the way it was hidden behind things was really interesting. And around this time, that's why I want to like kind of set the scene, because Hillsong, as you mentioned in your video, promo video, the theology intersects with hella other things that were happening. Like I mentioned with the
Hmm.
Assemblies of God, but at this time, InterVarsity was huge in colleges, and I was
Hmm.
part of InterVarsity at Berkeley. I was part of Black Campus Ministries, and what was interesting is like about four of us leaders of Black Campus Ministries were queer, and it was very clear we were queer. I had a partner at the time. Like it was very I was very out, like, you know. But
Hmm.
then once I came in, then I started getting a lot of really invasive questions about if I'm sexually active, questions about am I really queer? Am I sure that I'm queer, right? But all these things were not talked about when I was hired into leadership. But suddenly, when I was in leadership, it was like they felt this license to do all this scrutiny work. And so I do feel like
Hmm.
with LGBTQ people in particular, it is literally like I think the church tries to trick queer people into feeling affirmed so that they
Yeah.
can push you into conversion therapy, like genuinely. And so
Oh
I like
wow.
when I was in InterVarsity, I really felt like I consider myself as someone who kind of has the vision or has the ability to know the discernment to know when a church is affirming or not. I
Hmm.
genuinely didn't know it was unaffirming. Why does it say that?
What?
The permanent ban thing?
Who's permanently banned?
Do you see it? I see it. It says the live. That's really weird. Hold on one second. Weird. I'll screenshot it so you can see it. I basically like yeah. I just think that there was a way that like queer folks were
Oh,
kind of enticed to
someone
come
over here.
into.
Sorry, someone is
Oh,
saying that it's not real.
oh, it's not real. Oh, why does it show up?
It's a
Yes, is
scam.
there?
Warning: permanent ban
Yeah,
will
I was like,
ensure if
what?
does not end in. Yeah. Okay, it's fake.
Okay, got it. Okay, got
Yeah.
it. Thanks. I was like, oh my gosh. But yeah, I think the way that like, and they talk about this in the documentary, like queer folks saying like, I didn't know Hillsong wasn't queer affirming, or suddenly I'm in Hillsong College and now I'm going through conversion therapy processes, or I'm being asked about this. And so I do think there's a way that there's a trickery that happens on purpose, particularly around LGBTQ people, to then condemn them. And I think that gets very dicey and scary.
Hmm. if it's a comment, it's fake. Okay, good to know. I definitely saw that too, and I was like, oh,
I
whoa.
was like, whoa. I was like, were we talking about something that we can't talk about?
Thank you, Justice, for that mod,
But
and thank you, Mama Cody,
yeah.
for letting me know that it was fake too. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. No, thank both of you. Thank both of you. And yes, yeah, the part of InterVarsity in college and UCC. I love United Church of Christ, so I appreciate that comment.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think I think the trickery is on purpose. Is all I want to say.
Hmm. Just to get as many people in uh, and really use them, like like because it's no question that it's not disputed that queer folks have a huge presence in churches and church spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and people exploit them for their gifts and their talents.
Mm.
Like for obviously for music, for greeting at the door, like taking advantage of like queer folks, but also just not affirming them and kind of playing this
Yeah.
game of like we want you to stay around, but we don't know. Like I remember someone saying that like, oh, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but
Mm.
I'm open to being changed. I'm open to learning type thing. But it was never like embodied. It was never practiced. There was never any curiosity or questions that were asked or it was just like, oh, I'm open to being wrong about this. But that was the end of the
Mm.
conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, something we talked about is that you were in leadership in Hillsong, one of the Hillsong churches, or you kind of moved up through leadership. And I'm just
Hmm.
curious, your perspective. One, I want to say I grew up Assemblies of God. I just saw that question. Assemblies of God, not Kojic. But something that, we're talking about the queerness and like the queer phobia that can happen and like the subtle conversion therapy that happens. But also overall in the documentary Hillsong College, they talk so much about the shaming, about the forced public confessions of pregnancy or sex, about all
Right.
these things that are happening. While we know Frank Houston is abusing children, Brian Houston is embezzling money. And
Yep.
so I'm curious your perspective of like the scrutiny of kind of the middle leaders while the upper leaders get to do whatever they want and the religious trauma impact of that.
The middle leaders.
Like kind of like the folks that aren't Brian Houston, like the college students who might be overseeing youth groups or whatever,
Oh
they're
yeah.
under
Like
this intense scrutiny, and then the actual leaders get to do kind of whatever they want.
oh yeah. Like what I realized from the documentary is that like and just from my personal experience is that like um people who are in those positions of leadership, or the habit that Brian Houston had, is that he was willing to highlight everyone else's issues except for focusing on his own,
Mm,
and it was a way of like I feel like getting people to look away from his errors. And then it came
mm,
to the when shit hit the fan with the Australian report when they came out and did a poll for the community about not a poll, but they had a hearing for the community about people who've experienced abuse. So when it
mm,
became that public and when it got to that level, that's when he had to face it. And then his position changed. He went from like highlighting everyone else's issues to saying like, oh, Satan is trying to attack the ministry.
mm,
And like we have
mm.
and people that's why people applauded when so Brian Houston brings to his congregation the news of him being under an investigation for covering up his father's sexual abuse.
Yep, that
And
was crazy.
he gets applauded after that.
Yes, standing ovation. I think it was something
Yeah.
wild like that. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like the
standing
transition
ovation.
from like it goes from like, oh, we're gonna highlight everyone else. And then when it got really big, that's when he threw Carl Lentz under the bus, I feel like, personally. I feel like he centered Carl Lentz's story. He went on Good Morning America. It was like overkill. You could tell that he was
Yes.
really trying to like get rid of him and trying to like highlight his failings, but not talk
Yeah.
his moral failings is what he called it, but not talk about his own as a leader.
Mm.
In fact, he was willing to blame the victims, saying that they tempted his father and it's your fault.
That was wild.
Hmm.
When there's a point in the documentary, if y'all haven't seen it, where basically Frank or there's the church trying to pay off one of Frank's victims, and Brian says like, "You tempted my father," and this victim was, I mean, be so beyond traumatized and harmed. And so just to see like just the cruelty, but also I really felt like watching the documentary, something we had chatted about a little bit before, is like Hillsong Church is basically like the ego child of Frank and Brian. Like that
Hmm.
these two men felt deeply mediocre their whole lives and really created a whole church structure to prop up their own ego and narcissism. And for Frank, it was really just to like create a pathway for his abuse and
Hmm.
to conceal his abuse under this like guise of like being a god figure. And so for me, even the psychology is unreal. Like the tie between the narcissism and pastoral work, which I told you, I think that we actually bias towards narcissistic traits for pastors. I think
Hmm.
we
We are.
mine for like, yeah, like who is the most narcissistic, self-aggrandizing person in this
Yep.
congregation? Lead us, you know? Like, and so I think that was for me was like, wow, like these two men like were able to, yeah, create a whole church structure to insulate them from their own sense of insecurity and lack of worthiness and to be predacious. And that's pretty unreal if you think about it.
Oh yeah, like when they talked about Brian Houston's or Frank Houston's life before he became a pastor, um, and it's like when someone like that it is known that abusers seek out religious spaces because they know that when they get caught up, that it's not going to be as harsh as if they were in other spaces like the education system or whatever else, because they
Mm.
know that the church is going to one cover it up, is going to try to protect their leaders, try to protect the people. You will have the parishioners like doubling down and trying to defend them and trying to hide any because I think people need it if people's ability to um, if people's way that they view people that lead them, like when they have leaders that they respect and they
Mm-hmm.
admire, it's very difficult to accept some of these hard truths about them. And so, like with Frank Houston being an abuser, and one child spoke up about this abuse, and he was assaulted. That I think that's just
Punched.
a case in point. So for those who don't know for those who didn't watch the documentary, they talked about a scene in which, or they talked about a moment in which a child, I think it was a child, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, said what Frank Houston did to him, and he was
Mm-hmm.
assaulted, like he was punched or something by another church member, and the guy said, "Don't talk about my pastor like that," or "Don't say
Mm.
that about Frank," you know. And it's like they need it to be they can't accept that truth, and so that is the visceral reaction that you get from people who are trying to defend who they believe to be the man of God, and to
Mm-hmm.
also like deal with their own kind of uncomfortability and disruption of their kind of framework for having this man as their leader. Uh,
Mm.
so I think it
Mm.
was just, it's the perfect space in which to perpetuate abuse. Um, and you,
Absolutely.
and then when you add the narcissism piece, right? That like people who are charismatic, people who are outspoken, who act like they know what they're talking about, even if they don't. Like these are the people that we choose to lead in church spaces. These are the um, people that can get people to follow them, really. Um,
Yes.
and I think that's what became the issue when Carl Lentz came on the scene, is that he was the more charismatic, the more stylish, the more young, the more hip, the more quote unquote sexy pastor. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that also kind of bruised Brian Houston's ego and led to the eventual, him trying to take down Carl Lentz.
Oh yeah, everything you said, 110%, and absolute. One, I think what's interesting, what I want to go back to is something you said about how like these leaders can't be critiqued because then it's also leveraging a critique at God.
Hmm.
And most congregants are told if you critique God, like you are lukewarm in your faith, you are not trusting. There's this way that you are taught to not ask critical questions as a sign of your faithfulness, which is just how we perpetuate abuse, is by limiting people's curiosity and intuition.
Mm.
And I think what really shocked me, though, and someone had commented about this when I had a video talking about narcissistic abuse in Christian marriages, how people's mothers encourage them to stay in traumatic relationships. And I think what was
Ooh.
fascinating about the documentary was how many mothers did not believe their sons when they brought that abuse, how many mothers protected Frank Houston. And I think there's this complex relationship between patriarchy and women because like in the church, something that was emphasized to me, especially as a child of divorced parents, was God as a father. And like God is a father, God is your surrogate father. And I think something I saw emphasized to my divorced mother was like God is like a husband figure, right? And so I guess what I want to say is the way that church ropes women into, not saying women aren't culpable or accountable, but I think into this complex like father relationship with God, dating relationship with God, that then
Mm.
makes them enmeshed with pastors in a weird way. And that means that they're not protecting their own children or encouraging their children and their daughters to be in abusive dynamics. And so I think a lot of times we talk about men and the ways that they are entangled in these systems, but the mothers denying their son's abuse really stuck with me. Like that particular dynamic of who is denying abuse and who is in relationship with abusers or protecting abusers. I think for women, you're really taught to not question biblical authority because of where you sit in the church, and that causes abuse to be perpetuated, I think, as well.
Yeah, and like, and we see that with so in the documentary, the name of the documentary someone just asked is The Secrets of Hillsong. I think it was
Incredible.
originally it was on Hulu. I think it's on HBO Max now too. Someone just commented. I think Jackie just commented that it's on HBO Max
HBO Max. Okay, cool.
as well. So um, there was a scene in the documentary, or a part of the documentary, where they talked about how one of the children brought the abuse allegations to the mother, and she told him like, "You don't want to be responsible for sending all these people to hell." So you think about a child, right, who is a victim of child sexual abuse, and they go to their mother and confide in their mother, like, "Hey, this thing happened to me," and their mother responds and tells them, "You don't want to be responsible for sending these people to hell." You
Mm,
know, like the weights of the entire congregation's eternal resting place, right,
mm.
is resting on the shoulders of a child victim of sexual abuse. And so when people say like, "Oh, why did he wait all this time to come out?" and all, it's like these are the kinds of things that prevent people, like take people years and years and years to get over, and years to like be able to finally get to a place where they feel grounded enough to share their experiences
Mm-hmm.
in a way that's ready to deal with the backlash that they're going to receive from talking about these experiences. Um, but yeah, so like the mother dynamic is really interesting. And I think you're 110% right about how mothers are the theology that women in the church receive about not only God but their pastoral leadership, about
Mm.
people, about their husbands. You know, it's this, and there's this instinct, I think, to try to protect and try to preserve things and try to keep the peace. Um, but that was a really like gutting thing to hear, because
It was that.
I
Oh,
can't even imagine that or what that must have been like.
yeah. It was. That was difficult. That was a difficult watch. Episode 3, I think, is the most difficult watch of that documentary. That's when they really get into the Royal Commission and them looking into Hillsong and their hiding of abuse. Which one of my reflections was, wow, the U.S. is hundreds of years behind
Oh,
any type of system or process like this, which was my own kind of personal reflection of just where we
like
are.
I was like, could you imagine like if that was something like, obviously, like my research, my focus and my theology is on the study of Black faith and life. I'm really interested
Mm-hmm.
in Black churches, and I know that abuse doesn't get talked about in Black churches. I feel like
Yes. Yes.
there's a level of kind of there's another level of the theology and of the indoctrination and of the conditioning and of the cultural kind of pressure to kind of remain silent and to not like shake the table in any way, especially when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
the church. Um, and so I can't imagine if there's like just like if there was cause what happened in Australia, for those who don't know, is that there was a man who was in the government who like had a town hall or something to that effect, where people who were victims of of abuse in the church could come into the space and share their stories, and that launched this like really big investigation into Hillsong,
Mm-hmm.
and is what led to Frank Houston's crimes being exposed and things like that. So even though he never got held accountable for any of those crimes, he was able to get away with it for 30 years, and he died and had a huge funeral, and everyone came to the funeral, and it was the
Oh
mayors and
my God.
politicians and all the police officers. They all came to the funeral to celebrate.
Yeah.
He was abusing children for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I can't. I would really. I think it would be really transformative and amazing to see something like that happen, especially particularly for the Black church community, where people can have a space to go into and share about their experiences, so we can kind of root out some of these predatorial. um, folks and things like that. Because I think
Yes,
it would be staggering just like that. The response that came from the Australian people for that was hundreds and hundreds of people came in to talk about their experiences and tell about their the things that they went through and under church leadership.
absolutely. I mean, well, the church has not yet had a reckoning, and I mean this both for Pentecostal and I think Catholic denominations has not had a full reckoning around sexual abuse, child sexual abuse. Yes, these things come out, but I think that full reckoning just is not has not come,
Oh, not
and
not
particularly not at all. And the Pentecostal church or the Protestant church is in general have been able to really stay out of the conversation, while I think Catholic Church took a lot more heat around this because obviously there is a theme of child abuse within Catholic denominations, but that same theme exists in Protestant denominations too. And I
they
think
do.
that conversation is just happening. But as you talk, like there were so many places I wanted to go with what you shared. I think one was like I'm not a missions trip girly. Like I'm not pro missions trip. I'm not pro that type of theological work because I think I don't genuinely know if we can ever do missions work outside of a colonial framework because of
Me
just its
neither.
deep history.
Yeah,
So I'm not a big fan of missionary work. I'm transparent about that. But I think what was something I just genuinely hadn't thought of. I don't like missionary work because I find it to be colonial. I don't think we should go serve another community but actually just want to convert them and like bring in our very paternalistic. But I had never thought about also as a vehicle for child abuse. And what really stuck with me was Frank has gone all over the world. There still has not been a reckoning for anything that happened in Australia. But through missionary work, he has been, I'm sure, dozens of countries. And so that's something that stuck with me as well as all of these black and brown children who will never receive any type of reckoning around their experience. And so I think like when we talk about Hillsong, like it's impact in Australia and the US, but what really scares me is like the global impact of harm that will just can
yeah,
never be quantified,
yeah,
we'll just never know. We'll never know.
yeah.
And I feel for
I
those
just saw someone
kids,
comment that the impact that the church has had in Africa is astronomical in this regard.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
yeah, so I can't even imagine, right? Like people already don't care about
yeah.
Black lives; they don't care what happened to Black lives in Africa, um, and or anywhere on the planet for that matter. But
Mm,
like I can't even conceptualize some of the things that have gone unreport. Like reporting things is not even a thing in a lot of these spaces, right? Like that's not even a thing that you would think to do. Something that you deal with
mm.
internally in order to keep the peace. You talk to your elders and they counsel you, or whatever the case may be, and it's like you just have to get over it. You have to pray and you have to. Um, so the idea of reporting abuse, and I think the reason why it keeps happening in Catholic spaces, and we keep seeing stuff about Catholic Church, and people want to make the Catholic Church the butt end of the joke, is that people
Mhm.
who are in Catholic churches tend to be white, and they tend to have a better. There's more space, I think, and there's more knowledge about how to go about these processes in the formal way of like reporting
Mhm.
and things like that. Because I don't know anyone who
Well,
knows how to like do that sort of thing. Like I don't know anyone who knows how to do
yes. No, definitely. And some of the work I get to do in consulting, which actually Donnell and I got to recently partner together, he got to come talk to some of the Black church pastors that I train around LGBTQ theological inclusion, and he was amazing. And something that's real is like, as someone who does like diversity, equity, and inclusion policy work, like churches need it too. They need grievance processes, they need harm reporting strategies. And I think churches have been very reticent to engage. They don't want to engage in corporate business models as it relates to accountability, but they will financially. And
it.
so
Hmm.
it's like if you want to take on these corporate models for how you take on your tithes and offerings, not really giving back to your congregants, which is something that came up in Hillsong, is like
Yeah.
they would take hella money. But one of the congregants said, like, well, can we give back to our congregation? They're like, we can't give people large sums of money. We don't think there's legal precedent for that. And she was like, what? And so I
Hmm.
think a lot of corporations, yeah, they want to have that business structure. They don't want to have that actual accountability structure. And we need them. And secondly, I'll say, like, I'm really passionate about theological reinterpretation because, like, man, do we need it. And I made a video recently talking about like this church's focus on controlling queer people's behavior. Particularly through the passage of Sodom and Gomorrah, saying that queer people are violent, queer people are assaulters. That's the message, right?
Hmm.
But we see how, like, if we actually read that passage correctly and talked about the harm of sexual assault and sexual violence, the dangers of this in our communities, we could actually be creating safer church communities. And so all of this problematic theological interpretation means we have really missed the point, I think, of so much of biblical text around, like, caring for one another, mitigating harm, having harm reduction strategies, having care strategies for after harm occurs. Like, it doesn't matter. And the last thing I'll say is, you had said, which is true, there's not a culture of reporting, but there is a culture of confession. And I think that's
Mm.
so important to have that to talk about that distinction. Like, people would say, like, one of the kids said that someone approached him and said, like, we've seen your file, you have a homosexual past, but he was molested as a child. So the way that these framings happen, like they said that, like the Hillsong College, one of the kids said, like, they pulled me aside and said in your file, and then he was like, actually, like, I was harmed and I was assaulted. And so also how, even when you do report harm, you are seen as the tempter, you are seen as what brought this on. There is
Yeah.
not a culture of understanding that we are not culpable for the violence that happens to us. And I think some of that's because of all these misreadings of violent passages as being about homosexuality, when really it's about patriarchal violence and its implications. What does it mean when we have theological frameworks that say certain people's bodies are less than? How does that empower men in the church to then harm those people? I think that's the conversation, but it becomes something else, which is so frustrating, you know?
Yeah, like, and speaking of like the piece about bodies, right? Like I read Sensual Faith by Levon Briggs. If you haven't read that book, it's really amazing. But one
Mm,
of the things she says in there, and it's also, I think, one of the
I need to read that.
it's a
Write that down.
very, huh? You can hear me?
I'm gonna write that book down right now. I'm gonna read
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah.
I'm
It's
gonna
really
get my
good.
notes.
Sensual Faith by Levon Briggs.
Sensual faith. Okay.
Um, like a couple of theological things I think, or theological frameworks that are problematic. Just to add to what you already said,
Mm,
is just the simplicity of like us talking about bodies. LeBron talks about in her book how if we can't talk about the body, we can't talk about the things that happen to the body.
mm,
So
mm,
I
mm.
imagine that when
I
that
love that.
child said, that talked out loud about what Frank Houston did to him, it was not only about him saying this thing about Frank Houston. It's probably also about him saying something so kind of profane, quote unquote, or off the wall, because we don't talk about bodies
Mm,
in church spaces.
mm,
We don't talk about body parts. We don't talk about. We can't say the anatomically correct names for our bodies, even though they're in the
mm,
even though, like, obviously we have a body. And on top of that is the distrust that we're taught to have in ourselves and in our bodies. I think a
mm.
lot of Christian theology is about perpetuating a disembodied theology where
Yes,
you're like not
yes.
connected to your body, you're not connected to what you're feeling in those internal intonations, and um, I think that, and we're taught that those internal feelings, whatever they are, like the bodily sensation, like we all have these bodily sensations of when you feel like you're in danger, like you have those bodily
Mm-hmm,
sensations when you feel like something isn't right, something just isn't right in your gut. You have those kind
mm-hmm,
of guttural, kind of that internal compass, that we all kind of have, but we're taught to demonize that. We're taught to
mm,
say, like, that thing that is inside you, that's like, that's make those feelings are the enemy, right?
mm-hmm.
You can't think about the flesh. You have to think about the spirit. So you spend
Yes,
your
and that person said
entire,
submit. Sorry, the person was agreeing with you. They said you're taught to submit every thought to God. So I just want to say yes,
yeah.
yes,
So
yeah,
any like, oh, this doesn't feel right. This isn't okay. Like, all those things are
yes,
shut down by this
yes.
kind
They're
of
dampened.
flesh and spirit understanding of binary. It's the white supremacist binary. Everything is a binary. Heaven and hell, flesh and spirit. Either you're hot and cold. If you lukewarm, you. It's like that's a part of that binary structure. So when we talk about the
Yeah,
flesh and the spirit, like, submit not to the flesh, but you have to submit to the spirit. Like, that
yeah.
leads to a lot of internal doubt about the things that you're feeling, and it leads
Mm,
to an inability to actually say out loud what you're experiencing, to honor those internal
mm,
feelings that you may have, um,
mm.
and to stand on them, and to allow them, and allow them to, like, inform how you practice your spirituality, allow them to inform how you, the people that you're around, the spaces that you find yourself in.
Yeah, yo, yes. One, I want to say thank you, Sparkles. That was such a nice comment, and I appreciate it. And Eden, I agree with you. Yes, intuition versus Holy Spirit, and everything Donnell said is like just 10,000% on point. And it's so funny because I was gonna say the same thing around like repression of the body, and like y'all, the deep repression comes out in the documentary so much. Like, there's literally a scene, and I want to bring all this back because it's so important. Like, there's a
Mm-hmm.
scene where one in the documentary, which you already know, I thought this was so funny. There's like a nanny multi-level marketing scheme where like they would bring over pastors from Australia, and it's like, say like I'm married to a man, and then like I move and Donnell and his wife are head pastors. I would be Donnell's family's nanny, but then another woman and her husband would move, and then she would be my family's nanny. And it's like, why doesn't everyone just watch their own kids? Like,
Mm,
I
yeah.
don't know why I don't need to be a nanny. I can just watch my own children. So that was already weird, and I felt like spoke to like heteropatriarchal theology, like trying to keep first ladies in their place of like being nurturing, being caretakers of women, all that stuff. But something that happens is like Carl has an affair with his nanny, who's also another pastor's wife. Laura sees the affair and literally punches this woman in the face, which was really wild. That's such a wild
Yeah.
documentary. But what speaks to the repression is they never spoke about this incident again, which is genuinely like the most emotionally dysfunctional thing I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
To have
Yeah.
an affair in your home, violence to occur in your home, and there's never been a conversation. And I think in church communities, like that, like you said, that repression of self, that disconnection from the body and what's happening can be so profound. And something that happened for me is I deconstructed my faith, and I have a recent video on this. I talked about how much I had to return to the body, how I found I had unprocessed rage, unprocessed shame, unprocessed frustration, all these emotions I didn't even know that existed in my body, because theology said, well, you pray away anger, you pray away jealousy, you pray away envy. But that is just repression. And I think
Mm-hmm.
when you are 13 years old, learning to say,
Wow.
God, I give you my anger. When you're 13 years old, saying, God, I give you my sadness, you are not learning any healthy coping mechanisms. And I know for me, at 19 years old,
Wow.
like really being brought to the knees of by my queerness, and having to ask myself, like, am I going to accept myself or repress myself? When I said yes to my queerness, what I found was an emotional garden that I had never tended to, that I didn't know existed, because I was in a church that told me like the devil is there. And I think what killed me is I found God there. Like I found God in all of my emotion and all of my intuition. And so I felt so angry that God was in the place I was told that God was not. Like that made me so
Mm-hmm.
angry for so long. Even my first queer experience, like I found so much God there. And
Mm-hmm.
so just the way we teach people to miss themselves by such a limited abusive theology, like makes me so angry. And so for me, it was deconstruction was crashing into my body with
Yes.
very little tools to deal with that emotional pain. And it was difficult, you know? So I just think I love that you said returning to the body, because I think for religious trauma, like that's where the healing
Oh
really
yeah.
is, you know?
1000%. Like
Yeah.
that's all. That was also part of my like deconstruction too. Like one of the first times that kind of the thing that really spurred my journey in deconstruction is like
Mm-hmm.
being in the church that I grew up in, and having this internal feeling. It was one of the first, like, it was like, I was in college. So I was like early 20s. But I had this feeling, like this kind of like experience. I can't even explain it, but I felt
Mm.
inside that if I don't leave here, I won't grow. It was a,
Mm.
it was an internal
Whew.
feeling. And that
Yeah.
was the first time that I like ever honored that. It took me 2 years after that
Mm.
experience to eventually to like kind of muster up the courage to like write that email and say like, or send that letter to my pastor and say like, hey, we're not, I'm gonna transition to a different church. I wasn't leaving the faith. I was just
Mm.
going to a different church. I just knew I couldn't remain where I was. Um,
Yes.
and that was an internal feeling. It wasn't something that I read, and like I wasn't reading the Bible. I wasn't praying, and this came to me. Like this was like an internal kind of knowing. Um,
Mm.
and so that's why I really like to frame the deconstruction process as the journey of coming back home to yourself. That's all it is. Like you grow
Mm-hmm.
up as a child, and you kind of you have this kind of wisdom that doesn't get acknowledged because you're a child, right? And our culture
Mm-hmm.
kind of hates
Mm-hmm.
children. That's a whole nother conversation. Um, but you get told what to think and how to behave and what to believe and who to talk to and who not to talk
Wait,
to.
we have to pause. We have to pause. You said something big there around our culture hating children. I just want to say
Oh
yes.
yeah,
I'm going to say, I just want to
we
highlight
need
that
to
that was
circle back.
yes.
We need to, because like
Yeah, we circle back
that's
to
one of
that.
my
That's real.
biggest. That's
Yeah.
one of my biggest kind of like um I don't even know what the word is. Like it gets me riled up in a real way, in a real visceral way, because I
Mm.
remember being that child and I remember being told like how to exist in the world. And of course, as a child, like you listen to the elders around you, you know, but you also have
Mm.
this knowing. Like I had this knowing of like when things didn't feel right. I had this knowing of,
Mm.
when what we said we believed didn't line up with what we were doing. Like I had this internal
Mm.
knowing, but like I suppressed it. Like you said, like I was taught to like kind of dismiss it and be like, that's just the devil. This is what we do. This is a church.
Yes.
This is just what we do here. So that kind of wisdom and that kind of like internal knowing gets suppressed. You spend your whole life suppressing it. So when you finally get to a space of like asking the questions and interrogating your faith and trying to figure out who you are, what you believe, like it's all a
Mm-hmm.
journey of coming back home to yourself and getting back into your body, um,
Mm.
and feeling grounded in that. But that's
Mm.
also scary for people who have spent their entire lives disconnected from that and demonizing that thing.
Yes. Oh my. Well, it's terrifying because, like, as Similar said, you're taught not to believe or trust your intuition. And as you said, Donnell, like you're taught that is the devil, and like how
Hmm.
terrifying to be living in your body and afraid of it, to be in your mind and afraid
Ooh.
of it, and like
Yeah.
what a way to live. And I remember even just being 13 or 14, and like I think really developing anxiety as a result of the theology I was given, because it's like you're taught to like even renew your mind, right? So it's like
Hmm.
if you have a thought about a boy or a thought about a girl, a thought about a person, or you feel angry for a second, you feel this shame. You're taught to just have this, I think, visceral shame experience day in and day out. And that takes a long time to recover. And I also think in general, like the theology that I think is so broken in the church is the idea that we start separate from God. Already that's to me the
Yeah.
most fraught theology.
Oh
The
yeah.
idea like so many pastors, I think your pastors will get up on stage and be like, like there's nothing good in me, there's nothing good about me. Like that is not a way that we should talk about our bodies, the self, or to say everything good about me is just God's spirit. It's not me. But if us and God are connected, then it is you. It's your body, it's your soul, it's your
Yeah.
mind. And so
Yeah.
just this theology of separating, and I used to run an LGBTQ deconstruction group. Honestly, let me all know if you all want me to bring that back. I used to run it during the height of COVID, and then I just didn't have it for a while, and I thought about bringing back this deconstruction group. It was just a pro bono group I ran on Sundays, and something that we would talk about a lot in that group is I would say like I would have us do a practice where we would sit and like for 2 minutes we'd sit in silence. And I found for queer people, the idea that God loved them was too big of an idea. But I would say,
Oh.
let's sit in 2 minutes a day. I want you to sit and just imagine a world where God loved you. Let's just start with that. Let's just imagine the radical experience of you being loved as you are for 2 minutes. I want you to practice that
Mm.
and then expand it, because we had to start there. And the biggest question people would ask me every time we did that work, every Sunday was, are we making up a God who loves us? Are we creating a God who loves us? And so the ways that we have enmeshed God in general for queer people and non-queer people with this idea of rejection, this idea that we have to hustle and work hard for God to
Mm.
love us,
Yeah.
like has really, really warped people's perception of, I think, spirituality and well-being. And I think people feel like, well, this idea that God could just love me as I am, like that's an easy idea. When I think actually for most of us, the idea that we are worthy as we are is the journey we're learning for the 100 years or 80 years we're alive. Like
Yeah.
that is actually the hardest lesson to learn. But we say the fact that God would love us is easy, and we need a rigorous, mean God. Why? White supremacy exists, sexism exists, racism exists. Why would I then need a God that then would reject me too? When I live in a society, in a world that's predicated on my rejection. I just don't get that. So anyway, I'm off my soapbox. But these are the things you made me think about.
Yeah, like that.
Makes you
That's one of the
mad.
biggest things, that the born sinner thing. It like absolutely not. That
Yes.
doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me that children are born bad. And so, like from a 2 year old, when
Yes.
kids are doing the terrible twos things and like being kids and being curious, and sometimes they may be exploring things, or like making a mess or touching things that they shouldn't
Mm,
be touching. Like
mm,
we connect that. Think about that. We connect that to them being born bad
mm.
when they're just kids exploring and trying to like. grapple with like the world around them. They're new at life,
Mm.
but we
Mm.
take that to a point where we like kids who are being bad. It's because they're kids. Kids are bad because they're born bad. Because they're born,
Mm.
um, as the child of Adam, and being a sinner. And for me to learn that the idea of the born sinner idea, like I took a class called Augustine, Niebuhr, and Malcolm X in high school, in grad school,
Oh, I want to hear about this. That's so fascinating.
and we talked about Augustine and his
Mm.
story and how he is the one who kind of popularized the born sinner idea, right? And are you familiar with that whole story?
No, I've no. This
So,
you're teaching me. I'm learning.
so Augustine of Hippo, North African man, he had a really complex spiritual journey. Went to different spiritual traditions, and he was converted to the Christian faith. But one of the things that he struggled with is his sexuality. He was just
Mm.
insatiably like wanted to be sexual all the time, and
Mm.
so he rationalized within himself, like after just like not being able to uh, the challenges with grappling with this. He said, "Oh, so this just means I was born bad. Like I can't even help myself."
Mm.
He talked about a story about how he stole something, and he was like, "It's not. I didn't even want to do it. It just I didn't need to do it. I didn't need to steal this thing, but I just did it because
Hmm.
And so like he took that those kind of complex experiences and created this idea that like, oh, I'm born bad, right? And this is just inside
Hmm.
of me. I can't help but be this thing, and that's why I need to be connected with the divine, and et cetera, et cetera. It's more
Wow.
complex than that, but that's where the idea
No.
of it.
Yeah.
That's where that idea came from, and that's the idea that took root, right? So people who make mistakes and who like it makes sense why that idea took root in development of Christian thought.
Hmm.
It makes sense, right? Because people make
Yeah.
mistakes, people do bad things, and so if they tell themselves that, "Oh, I can't help but do this thing. I'm a
Hmm.
born sinner. I'm born bad."
Hmm.
Um, that is the um, that kind of it makes sense to them, and it helps
Hmm.
them to it increases their ability and the necessity of them trying to connect with God, right? Like I
Yeah.
need to connect with God. I can't do this on my own. I can't be a good person on my own because I'm born bad.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Like I think that this is actually a really good segue, I think, into some of our conversations about race in Hillsong, and because I want to get your thoughts on a lot of that. And the reason I say that is because there is this right born sinner theology, which I think is uniquely weaponized against women and LGBTQ people, and Black folks. And so I want to talk about that because what was interesting about the documentary, of course, is I've mentioned that Frank Houston's acting up, Brian Houston's acting up, everybody in the Houston family, they're acting up. They're going buck wild. That's just the reality. This family is acting up. But like the politics of redeemability are so clear because like Frank Houston and Brian Houston are unwaveringly redeemable. There's nothing they can do that won't be forgiven. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times with the head pastors too, the only reason Carl was axed, as Donnell mentioned, was not because of his affairs. It is because his ministry was a threat to Brian's power. That's it. Because
Mm-hmm.
there were many other folks doing a lot of things that shouldn't be doing and that Brian never held accountable. And so the reason I want to bring up the politics of redeemability is because I want to think about, yeah, like who in our churches is asked to be accountable and who is not. And like, how does that go along racial lines, gender lines? And how does that relate to other things that were happening in the church with race around the 2016 election? Like, that's when we see Lecrae come out with his video, talking to evangelical pastors around slavery. That's when we see all this. So I guess I want to say, like, who was forgiven in the church and who was held accountable? And how does it also maybe relate to some of our conversations around race and inclusion in the church and this kind of thing that was happening in Hillsong with Carl and him trying to bring up race, all that. I wonder if we can get into it.
Um, so with Carl Lentz, I think that um, so his for those who don't know, the Carl Lentz Brian Houston dynamic was
Wait, I'm
very.
so sorry. I'm so sorry. Now I just want to answer real quick. Similar, we do not. I don't have a podcast. Donnell, do you have a podcast?
I don't have a podcast.
Okay, I don't have a podcast. We don't have a podcast.
I'm
Sorry,
working
keep
on it.
going.
I'm getting there. My bad, Joe.
I think about it sometimes too. I don't have one, but yeah.
Um, So
Sorry, Donnell, say it.
redeemability, like, so
Yeah.
I think of Carl Lentz, right? After he has gone through all this, he's now come out with the documentary. He's, gone through the. I would say that he kind of got his lick back. Is how I would say
Hmm.
it.
That's what I think too. That's a good way to say it. Yeah,
He got
absolutely.
his lick back. Like Brian Houston went on Good Morning America and said he's narcissistic behavior and moral failings, and he was like, whole time this man was making me do 17 services every Sunday. I was traveling
Yeah.
everywhere. I was taking pills to keep up with the pressure. Um, and so I really so redeemability. What comes out in the documentary with Carl Lentz is that he was a victim of abuse as a child, right? And he
Hmm.
kind of talks about that experience and how that kind of informed his, sexual escapades
Hmm.
and things like that. Which I get. And I hate that that happened to him. I hate that that would happen to any child.
Hmm.
And so I think I just find it really strange now that Carl Lentz has been made a consultant for Mike Todd's church.
I was hoping we get into that. Yes, his work with transformation
So
church
like,
is
so
yeah,
it's like, and they, have come out and said like, oh, like, it's all about redemption and we believe in, people can be redeemed and he's forgiven and he's accepted here and all these different things. But it doesn't seem like that move was made in consideration for his care, and
hmm.
it
Hmm.
seems like it was just like now he's going to be a consultant to help you expand your ministry, and you're going to take on the redeemability aspect of it. But
Hmm.
what it really seems to me is that you're driving more traffic and attention to your church,
Yep.
and you're getting someone on your team who knows how to build and expand the church,
Hmm.
and you're using his talents to. And I won't be surprised if Carlos starts speaking at
I think he's going to.
transformation soon.
Yeah, I think they're going to appoint him. I saw a video. I saw someone. I forget what article it was. Maybe it was like People or something. Basically, someone had written an article where they said like after this documentary comes out, they think this is Carl Lentz's launch of return to ministry
Hmm.
and trying to frame himself in a certain way, which I think is true. I mean, in the documentary, he tries to frame himself as very apologetic and as having transformed. That's hard for me because I think, as you mentioned, it is tragic and abhorrent that he experienced sexual abuse as a child.
Hmm.
I do think my read is that he's also very abusive to his wife, in my opinion. I mean, the amount
Oh
of
yeah,
affairs,
one hundred
the amount
percent.
of lying, I mean, just really, Laura has really had to be, and I talked about this before, the reservoir of his growth, of his pain. She has had to hold all of that. And it reminds me of when I did a video on this a while ago, but when John Gray had said about his wife, right? Like, she's a coat 2 sizes too big. I can't fit her. She had to raise me into the man I
Oh,
was. And so
oh,
thinking,
that
all
don't
that mess
even
was
get me.
all that was a mess, right? So like just
Yeah.
the work first ladies are doing to incubate their men. So like, just like what's going on there? I don't know. I've been with a woman for a long time, so I'm like, what's going on? But I so that's one thing. But yeah, I think like who is redeemable? It's like these white male pastors in particular, and we see what black male pastors too, and black churches particularly, can have affairs, can do whatever, and still come back to ministry, making money. I mean, I think yes, like Carl was publicly shamed, but I'm sure his bottom line hasn't changed. I'm sure he will get his fancy ministry job soon, and he's
Oh,
probably been
one
doing
hundred
stuff
percent.
behind the scenes. So it's frustrating. And the thing that I think was interesting is Carl atones for many things in the documentary, but he does not make any apologies for his lack of engagement with race. And that's something that you and I both kind of talked about.
Okay.
So I want to hear your thoughts a little bit
So let
about
me get started. I was like, okay, damn,
that.
Carl. I
Donnell was
was
not
like,
playing games, y'all. He did not like this.
so I was like, damn, Carl went through some stuff that's. I was really feeling bad for Carl at a point in the documentary.
Mm-hmm.
Like when he started talking about what he had to experience, and I know that that pressure is very real. Like I went to a church where they had 5 services on Sunday. Like it's really intense, and he was having 7 services. I think 6 or 7 services on Sundays in New York City.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Like the amount of him saying that he had to like take pills and all these different things and then of course
Yes.
the child abuse things. But then
Mm-hmm.
he started talking about race. And not only does he start talking about race, he's like unapologetic. So and I think
He
that's
was
what
really
also frustrates me.
unapologetic.
that's
Yeah.
one of the frustrating things that frustrates me about him being connected to like another black church is that like I'm not sure how much of that factored into him coming on to the staff, like him being a pastor
Mm.
who had the aesthetics of saying Black Lives Matter. Um, and he said it, and he was one of the people that was saying it, but
Mhm.
that's kind of where it stopped when it came to like
Mhm.
the embodiment of that, and when it came to how do we make intentional choices to make our congregation and to make our music ministry and et cetera, like the people on stage more diverse to reflect the audience. Um,
Mhm.
that stuff wasn't taken seriously, and so here you have the juxtaposition of the black parishioners who are saying, "Hey, there's this issue with race. We're not seeing any representation
Mhm.
of race of the people in the stage or in the audience on the stage. How can we fix that to make this a more inclusive space, to make this a space that Black people feel comfortable coming to?" Um,
Mm.
and so they said for about 3 weeks, we saw Black folks on stage, and after that, it was over.
Mhm.
And so when Carl Lentz, and it's this kind of thing that happens with race in America, right? Where like it's like there's nothing we can do, like and there's this like kind of idea of like the reverse racism thing is very real. So I feel like they thought that it was racist to intentionally put Black people on stage.
Mhm. Mhm.
But you're doing that with the white folks.
Mm.
You're doing that, whether
Mhm.
consciously or not. Whether you're consciously saying like, I'm going to make sure it's white people up here. Your internal prejudices and biases are reflecting in the people that show up on stage every Sunday, right?
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
refused to deal with that. And when he was confronted on that, he was like, "Well, like I did the best I can. Like I did a lot. I did a lot more than people were doing." And he kind of like stood 10 toes. And I was like, "Okay, you're done. I'm not." I'm not rocking with you anymore.
Yeah. No, it was very basic. And I think that time was very intense I mean, all times are intense in America for race relations, but particularly in churches, there was this unique conversation happening 2014, 2016. As Trump was gearing up, it was very clear white evangelicals were aligned with Trump. And
Mhm.
Assemblies of God overall is a white denomination, but like my church was a mega church, probably about 3,000 people. But I would say about 30% Black. Our head pastor was white, but our choir was Black. And so that brought in, I think, a lot of Black congregants was the music was popping. But the reason I say that is because in Assemblies of God churches, and of course that's the parent denomination of Hillsong, it was very clear that there was a bias towards white leaders and
Mhm.
also a very particular bias towards a certain type of white aesthetic. Like you wanted people to dress a certain way, to look a certain
Oh
way.
yeah.
There's such I don't think we talk enough about the beauty politics of preaching because that's always at play, right? It's like there's a lot of
What did I tell
attractiveness
you?
politics, right? There's so much attractiveness from just physical attraction to also dress to cadence of speech, all of that. And so I think that what a lot of white Christians think is their faith itself is a type of allyship. When I pray in the morning, I'm showing my moral goodness. When I come to this Sunday service, I'm showing my moral goodness. And now I've acknowledged that racism exists. Like I'm the pinnacle
Oh yeah.
of Christianity. I'm the pinnacle. And so I think it just becomes so much about like white moral ego. And then Black
Whew.
congregants are really just lost in that. And I think what's fascinating is I did see how particularly Black women were talking about their volunteer labor being exploited by Hillsong, them really playing the background. And so that's fascinating. And the last thing I'll highlight is around this time of the fissure with churches voting for Trump, I had left my church very publicly, or like I'd already kind of left my church, but I really left my church very publicly at that time. And many Black congregants reached out to me to say, you know what, when you were a kid, like I heard the pastor say the N word in youth group, or this person said the N word. My child had this experience. And so also these real instances of racism in our church communities that aren't also addressed because we're just supposed to forgive. And so I think the way Black congregants have to really forgive what's happening in white churches. And when we don't forgive, we're seen as the problem, It's
Hmm.
a mess.
And so like and I just want to bring to the point again that like in this meeting, right? Lynch is having a conversation with Black parishioners who are
Oh,
talking about
yeah.
their experiences. There was a civil rights attorney there, right?
I
So
didn't know
this is
that.
yeah. I think they talked about there being a civil rights attorney that was present for this meeting, and this guy told him that like because Carl, I think, had some pushback of like, we can't just put black people up there every Sunday. We can't just do that.
Mm.
And what that guy told him is that like the institutions of racism were done intentionally. Like there was intentional choices being made. It wasn't, this didn't just happen because of there are more. It's like there were intentional choices being made to put white folks in position of power, to put white folks on stage, to put white folks in positions of leadership. And so it would stand to reason that you can be intentional about putting people on stage who reflect the parishioners, the people who are coming to the church. And so he did that again for 3 weeks, and then after that, it was died down. There was no other conversations had, and so for him to like the white moral ego thing was just so on point because like that's what came. It eluded from him. It was just like exuded from his, like he was like, I did the best I could, and I was doing what nobody else was doing at the time, and it was really radical for the time, and all these different things. But I think that's the difference between allyship and accomplishment, right?
Yes.
Because I think he was not ready to handle those conversations of people being like, it's kind of racist that you keep putting black people up here. But no one was doing that when he was just putting white people up there.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah. He just wasn't there. And I don't think Carl will get there around race because he doesn't want to be reflexive about it. So it's never going to happen for him around that revelation, which is interesting because now he's consulting for a Black-led church, which I find that fascinating as well. And as I mentioned, during this time, Lecrae is having conversations around theological. Okay, first of all, Oceans would definitely hit harder if it was sang by a black choir. That's really
what? Are you kidding me, bro? Oceans, the street, they'd been playing Oceans in the hood. Do you hear me?
Oceans on a Sunday afternoon. It's a bop. I'll probably still listen to Oceans a little bit. I don't know what the song is. Just it's banging. Also, I don't know how to save a live, so you all have to tell me how to do that before I leave the live.
No, it's already saved. Like it saves
already saved.
So like if you go to settings, it'll say like live replays, and you can like get the full download of the live on there. So I'll probably upload this on my YouTube.
I'll upload it too. Heck yeah, and I'll upload it on some snippets onto TikTok and stuff. So we'll save it, y'all. We'll save it. I guess it's already saved. But yeah, one that's really funny. Oceans would hit harder. Oceans was a good song, and we can't lie. Like Hillsong's music was catchy. Lead Me to the Cross. I've sang that song a million times.
No, but look, I can't even. I'm not a hater. That's one thing I'll never be. I will never be a hater. And the music was hitting. I'm sorry. The music was hitting every time. When I was the first time I went to the church that I transitioned to, which was a Hillsong Family Church. Like I remember literally getting chills from the music. And it was kind of cold in there, like, but that's the whole thing that that's kind of
they're creating an atmosphere.
That's kind of the part of the thing that they do to kind of like, zhuzh up the spirit, the temperature of the spirit, or whatever they call it. Worship leaders just come in and talked about how the church would make it, turn the temperature down, and so people would get goosebumps and all these type of things, which is like really sinister. I don't even want to. I can't even think about stuff like that because I'm gonna get mad. But
the emotional ambiance creation is wild. And you've done some videos, like you've done videos on like the cry nights and stuff at churches. I can't do it, Donnell, because I'm too traumatized. Every time I try to make a video about it, I have so much visceral trauma. I can't do it because I'm like, I just remember just the atmosphere that's created and the intense emotionality. I mean, the crying, the wailing, like, oh my God, Kinu, I know you know, like the emotional manipulation of worship services. Yeah, absolutely. And Hillsong, I don't know, they had those same 4 chords and they were hitting every time.
It was, man, look. It's the little bridge it's the little pauses in the songs where it's like 30 seconds of just like the drums building up, and you just like, it's a whole thing.
If you pause in the middle of your strum your guitar, you start being like, God, we're here today. I'm crying. I don't know why I'm crying. He got me. I don't know.
That's what I'm saying. Like, there's no way that you can come from a really conservative space and walk into an atmosphere like that and not feel like, oh, this is something different. This feels. Someone just said it's a whole concert experience. Like, and I've seen multiple people make videos about how like, if people who say they miss worship have never been haven't been to enough live concerts or whatever.
That video got me. Yeah, I was like, damn.
I was like, that's true. Like, it was definitely there was a stage and like people. It was like a performance. Like I'm
Yeah.
at the church I was at, people would run from behind the stage with the guitar, yeah, like you get excited, and then they get, are we gonna do this one right
Yeah.
here, guys? And then they go right into it,
Going wild in the front
and
row.
it be hitting. They start with the slow song, and then they do the fast one, and they do the. They
Yes,
had the music piece down pat. I'm telling you,
they
and I think
did.
that's
And
what, yeah.
no, I mean, this comment, I felt the spirit though and prayed for people who were possessed. Yes. Oh my gosh. If I could go back to the things I did between 13 and 19, like when I felt moved by the spirit, like it's weird to look at it through my perspective now because I'm not in that, like, I'm not indoctrinated, which really is what we're all experiencing and what we're talking about is a form of indoctrination that for so much of us, for most of us, is tied to a really pure desire to connect to something beyond ourselves, to be a part of a community beyond ourselves. And churches know, I think, how to really, yeah, foster an environment that feels like some sort of revelation or transformation is happening. And I think what's scary about this documentary is that we also see that we're actually, many of us were in deeply dysfunctional, harmful, unsafe environments
Whew.
while having these curated emotional
And so
experiences.
you're like,
And
God
like,
must be
what?
here. God must be in the
Yes.
building. Like I got
Yes.
all types of goosebumps. The spirit is leading me with my to the waters and all types of stuff.
I used to have a
Um,
pastor who'd be like, the Holy Spirit's thick in here. I'm like, yeah, it's day 5 of church camp. We're sweating. It's not the Holy Spirit. Okay. But like, all that stuff.
so I wanted to circle back to volunteer abuse, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
this is a thing that doesn't get. It's not even considered a term. Like people don't even know what you talk about volunteer abuse. Like what's volunteer abuse, or what's like. There's other
Mm-hmm.
words for it, but the notion that you have to like what happened over and over in Hillsong from the college experience, from them going to Hillsong College. They talked about how students at Hillsong College would just be serving at the church. They had like
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of people just doing volunteer labor, but working like
Mm-hmm.
50 and 60-hour weeks coming to the church. They were doing it for free. And there's this, and you talked about the idea that that people just they're doing it like you feel like you have like that's your spiritual obligation, and the church tells you that
Yes.
we can't pay you because that's we don't give large sums of money to people. We can't put anybody on the payroll, but they tell these kids like if you serve the Lord, and I heard these messages constantly from evangelical pastors, mega church pastors like Stephen Furtick, all these people talking
Mm-hmm.
about how, and of course Carlins and everyone else, Brian Houston, talking about how like, if you remain humble and if you just serve and you're faithful to your serve, that God is, that there's a sermon that John Gray preached that talked about you're getting ready from what's your name again to we've been expecting you overnight. Like he talked about being a humble
Mm.
servant. He tells the story of David, how David was just tending to the sheep and he was just lowly and he was just doing his thing and no one was paying
Mm.
attention to him. And then he eventually, came on. So like I went to another John Gray sermon where he talked about like,
Mm-hmm.
I want to thank you for being, he did this rant. He said, I don't know who needs to hear this, but God is saying, thank you. Thank you for being faithful. Thank you for staying when
Mm.
people didn't leave or for staying when everyone else left. Thank you for being faithful to your volunteer things. Thank you for, like, he was talking as God, thanking people for basically, being exploited for their labor.
Yeah.
And and people were having emotional response. Of course, they feel unseen, they feel unheard, they feel
Yep.
undervalued, they feel unappreciated, and they're working for free,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when they hear stuff like that, it's like, okay, God sees what I'm doing. God sees
Yep.
that I'm trying and that I'm trying to do the best I can, and all these different things. And it perpetuates this culture of like, oh, we have to keep going and keep going and keep going. One of the things that got brought up in the Hillsong documentary is that one of the people said like people would literally be, be feeling physically ill, throwing up, whatever,
Yes.
and they will look at each other and be like, "Can you believe we get to do this?" This
Yes.
is like
Yeah.
this psychological like
Oh my
mind
gosh.
tricks of like,
Yeah.
can you believe that you get to be exploited and all it like and and
Yeah.
obviously I believe it. I believe in service. I believe in helping. I believe in you know being you know being a part of your community and helping in whatever way you can for the betterment of the community. But obviously it gets to a place, right, where people are getting exploited, and it's very easily to trick people who, or not trick people. It's very easy to,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I guess trick
I think it's
people.
tricking people. I think you're tricking people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very
It's
easy to trick people into um, like dedicating heart and soul to something because they don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, but they feel like if I just am faithful to this small thing, that
mm-hmm.
God is going to make me a ruler over many things.
Yes. I mean, you already know I felt like it was a nanny multi-level marketing scheme. I think in churches
Hmm.
we also have a labor multi-level marketing scheme where like we get to tell people, yeah, basically it's just a capitalist model where people at the top hoard money because they're getting all this free volunteer labor. Like you should be paying your musicians because that's a huge job to be at church, to be like composing your songs, whatever it is. Like you need to be paying your musicians, you need to be paying your choir volunteers. If people are cleaning your church, they should be paying. I mean, the amount of women I saw that put in hours and hours into children's ministry, running vacation Bible studies, creating this
Hmm.
curriculum. That's an
Whew.
education consultant. Pay them as such. You know what I mean? And so
Really?
it's also, yeah, like the way that labor is exploited and the way we teach people you're going to get something on the other side of this. And the
Oh
way
yeah.
so many, I think, like I said in the documentary, women of color and Black women, queer folks are saying, I poured out so much and I received nothing in return. And there was never a recognition of all that I gave and yeah, the impact. And something someone had mentioned that they were thinking about going to Hillsong College. They're glad they didn't. I'm also glad he didn't.
Yeah.
And at that time, when I first applied to college, actually, I'd written down a bunch of schools I wanted to apply to. And the top two were like Azusa and like Bethel, I think, or something. All these like some like really Christian schools because was of all my siblings, my mom raised me the most in youth group. And my brother, I remember he took it and he crosses off the list. He said, "Do not do that." He gave me a whole new list of schools to apply to, which saved my life. But I highlight this because this was happening at Hillsong College, but I hear the same stories at Azusa. I think it's
Oh yeah.
Gonzaga. You know, all of these Bethel, these Christian institutions have the same model of abusing volunteers, confessions with volunteers. Something else they had talked about was, you know, for the Hillsong College, they had to do a working with children's check. Like, could they work with children or not?
Yeah.
And y'all, the way that they would manipulate them into confessing that if they had sex or not, or confessing if they did this thing or not, and like making them feel safe to confess. And then they made them basically wear scarlet letters as a result of their confessions to say if you were a good Christian or a bad Christian. And if your scarlet letter was red, everyone would know that you have had moral failings. And so I think it's the volunteer abuse, but also the extreme scrutiny of these people who are already giving their time, and then you're scrutinizing their emotion, their thoughts, their emotional behavior, their psychology. I mean, a concerted breaking down of somebody, and that's really what is breaking people, you know, and making them be completely dependent on the church for a sense of affirmation, for a sense of identity. I mean, I think the psychology is much deeper than we give it credit for. And even for myself watching, I thought, wow, I should really like tend to, again, the religious trauma that I've experienced in my body because I've done all this and more. You know, I've been through all this and more. So it's just, yeah, that volunteer abuse is just
The
not
comments are
something I think that
pouring
we
in.
talk
People
about
are
enough.
talking just about like, I grieve for all the years, for the years that I gave to, for the free labor that I gave to churches.
Mm,
I composed and sang for so many hours. They never paid me from 8 to 19 year olds at a mega church.
mm.
Um, People being selective with who they paid, paying their children, paying the pastor's son got paid, nobody else got paid. Like this is a thing that like we kind of like, and I was in that space too when our model. So I don't know what it is at these other institutions,
Mm-hmm.
but like because there was 5 services, and the idea was you sit one and you serve one.
Mm.
So you sit in a service and then you
Wow.
spend a service serving
For
people.
5 services?
No, not you don't serve.
I know, but you
Off a,
sit for a service and you serve over five
no,
services, right?
no, not sit
Oh,
one, serve one, sit one, serve one, but like
oh, okay,
just two. So
okay, got
that
it.
was the
Okay,
model. Some people obviously did more because they,
yeah,
when they were trying to like, work overtime to get that blessing from God.
yeah.
But the manipulation comes in when like any positive thing happens in your life, you attribute it to your faithfulness and volunteering. You attribute it to your faithfulness to the church,
Mm-hmm.
and so that obviously encouraged you to do more. And that also just perpetuates this culture of volunteer abuse. But like when I was in church, like I was, like I said, I grew up in a small church. I was going to church like 4 to 5 times a week. You know what I'm saying? Like
Mm. Mm-hmm.
between 3 to 5 times a week. Uh,
Yeah.
and just cleaning, doing, a lot of different things, composing.
Mm-hmm.
And even at the other space I went to, like I was, doing sermon writing, I was doing curriculum development, I was doing
Mm.
youth group coaching, like coaching people to come onto the to be a part of our youth group. So I was doing a
Yeah.
lot of like different things like that. And then when I wanted to draw back, and I was like, there came a point when I was like started to look behind the veil a little bit, and I was like, I don't know if I want to do this stuff anymore. It was like it was not accepted that I was like going to. Um, when I told people in leadership that I was, stepping down from doing youth ministry, which is what I was doing, I was told like, oh, so you're just going to transition to this thing. It was like that was just the conversation. It was
Mm.
like the conversation was like, oh, so you're stepping down from this to do this other thing, or
Mm.
okay, you want to be, serve somewhere else. But it's like, no, I want to chill. Like I want to chill.
You're like, I'm actually trying to
I'm
sleep.
done. What do you mean? I was like, no, y'all not understanding. Like,
Yeah.
I need to take a step back for a little bit. I need to reevaluate some things.
Yeah.
But there's this constant like push to get people to like serve, and if they want to step down, if they feel burned out, they feel overwhelmed. It's like, okay, maybe you can just serve less, and you can just,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you feel okay again, then you ramp back up the service. It's like
Mm.
it's just a never-ending cycle, and people do
Yeah.
it for years and years and years. And I
Mm-hmm.
mourn for like the people, the elders, especially in the Black community, who
Mm-hmm.
have been doing this, or who have been part of this kind of cycle of volunteer abuse for decades and
Mm-hmm.
decades and decades.
Oh, I agree. And I think like the way that Jesus is used, like this idea that we're all supposed to be like Jesus and like manipulate people into being Jesus. But I always think, well, Jesus is supposed to be the representation of God. So I don't need to be all the things Jesus was. And I don't need to give in all these ways. And yeah, I just think there's a lot of volunteer abuse. And I think for me, when I look back, even more than volunteering, I also just spent too many hours in youth group. It just wasn't a safe place to be spending hours and hours of my childhood. And something I think about a lot, and this isn't, I love my mom, it's not a big critique of her. I mean, I guess it is a critique of her, but it's also something to think about all parents is like, you need to, if you're going to put your child in a youth group, you need to go to a couple sermons to see what is being preached and what is being taught, the
Oh yeah.
culture of that youth group, the safety of that youth group. Because for me, like I was in signs and wonders classes and like spiritual warfare
Sorry.
classes. Like what is going on, And
I'm
like
sorry.
the things I would learn in those classes about like I would be like 12 years old and I'm learning about how hip hop is demonic and the teacher is white. So let's unpack the anti-blackness there. Let's unpack the weirdness that's happening there that's not being talked about. And I wasn't the only Black person in these classes, right? It's other Black youth that are in
Hmm.
there. I mean, I've been in classes where like 12 and 13 year olds are confessing to homosexuality or having demons cast out of them. I mean, these things are, it's trauma to experience, it's trauma to witness. And so I think just the way that, like I said, outside of the volunteer abuse, which is happening, all of these other just weird moments of enmeshment, which now I look back and I have so much compassion for my younger selves and the other young folks that were experiencing this. But at the time, it just feels so normal because you're in that environment day in and day out. And so I think watching the documentary gave me even more grace for myself and everyone else doing the work of deconstruction, because the way that they systematically teach you this theology, the way they teach you systematically to portray, to give over yourself to something else in hopes that you'll find approval and acceptance on the other side is, I think, just more profound than I think we even give it credit for. I mean, it's such a systematic process, and then suddenly you're giving 30 hours to your church a week because you're told there's going to be some type of reward there for you.
Oh yeah. Like and I think what makes it even worse with children's with kids getting just kind of dropped off at youth ministry, and is that parents are burned out, right? Especially like,
Yeah.
Black and brown parents are, everyone is, but obviously there's levels. People are
Yes.
burned out by the experiences of capitalism, and just having to work consistently. And so like we talk about now, it's come to the fore now, like with after the pandemic, just the issue with childcare that we have in this country, that there's not spaces
Mm.
for children to go and be watched and be safe, and not be exposed to harm or abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Those spaces are becoming fewer and fewer in between. And so a youth group is just a very easy space. Like you think like, okay, this is somewhere that's like going to take care of my kid. I can get a few hours. If you
Mm,
at a black church, you can get more than a few hours because we just be
mm.
we be just going and going. Um, it's just one of those things where parents are like they kind of feel like their hands are tied in that regard. Where like
Mm,
some do, some feel like, oh, this is your rite of passage. You just got to go to this youth group, and they'll take
yeah.
care of you. And you don't think like, oh, this is a church. They're not going to do anything to my child. That's the kind of the thought process.
Mm,
And that's one of the safe spaces that people feel like they can leave their children. But we now know that this is spaces where children experience the most abuse in a lot of cases, and it goes unreported
yes.
and under discussed.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, a lot of like, at least in Assemblies of God churches, like, you don't really need, and this ties into what you're saying, like, you don't need pretty much any education outside of biblical education to be a youth pastor in Assemblies of God churches. And usually you've been in that church for years and you have a good relationship with the pastor, so you're then appointed to be the youth pastor. And so I say that because I found that maybe my youth pastors at the time, I'm 13, they're 25, which is still pretty young. But you are not fully emotionally developed if you've only had biblical education, because it comes with such, particularly I'm talking about fundamentalist biblical education, because it's based in such a limited worldview. It's based in a very, oh, you're seeing something? I can't see the comments you see, actually. I think I
Yeah,
see different comments.
that's one of the things I hate the most about
Yeah. What are
this.
you,
Is that,
what are you seeing? I want to
but no,
hear. I
I
want to
just saw
hear.
someone said my childhood pastor didn't have an eighth grade education.
Yes, no, yes. These things are common. Like, I know many pastors that yeah, are not, maybe don't have a high school education, or didn't do anything, like I said, beyond Bible college. And so I think that also does lead to just problematic theology, because this person has a limited worldview experience. And also, most of my youth pastors were white men, and they have their own unique experience of the world that is very different from my own. And so, just thinking about what you said about the economics aspects, I think some of it is also the education aspects. And the one thing that my church had told me, after years of me serving in my youth group, preaching in my youth group, going through all the intensive leadership courses, I really have been in my youth group for years. When I basically when I got into Berkeley and decided I wanted to go, my church started to shun me already, because they were like, this is secular and you're going to go to Berkeley, and like, you're going to come back and you're not going to love God. And like we're
Berkeley?
so, yeah, they call it Berkeley. I was like, that's what my church called it.
What? Oh,
Berkeley,
I'm sorry.
you're going to this liberal sin ground. And now I know they think that because I like came out gay. Like,
They're
super
like,
progressive
see?
with my theology. Yeah, they're like, see, like, but I think like the reality is, like, if your theology cannot stand up to critical questioning, it's trash theology. I know that's like a strong language to use, but that is just like the most simple way I can distill it. Like, your theology has to be able to stand the test of critical excavation. We should be able to look at it historically. We should be able to look at it contextually, and it should have clarity. And if your theology can't be mapped onto actual living, it's bad theology. And I think the
But
reality is, so many of us have been giving bad theology, you know?
I just want to highlight a couple of
Yeah, please. I want to, because
comments
I can see your
here
comments, so I want to see what you're
because
seeing.
someone said I was in charge of dozens of kids at 15. I was homeschooled and didn't know shit about the kids. Um,
That's real. Why would you? But why
that's
would
not
you? You're
funny, but it's
15.
like
You shouldn't have
you were
known. But it's
15.
true.
Another
Yeah.
one said, "This is why I don't have a relationship with my mother because she allowed the church to parent me."
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes. And that's
and
a
they
real
talk about
thing.
the invalidation of children who bring up abuse in these spaces from their parents, because again, I think about that. If a child says like, "Hey, this thing happened to me at church. I didn't like it. It didn't make me feel comfortable." A parent who doesn't feel like their options are who don't have that much options in terms of like spaces where they can put their child,
Mm-hmm.
they're not going to think like to pull their kid out of the church. So I think the initial response is going to be to like try to attack or demonize the um, or invalidate the experience of the child
Oh, yes,
in order to preserve
absolutely.
that space.
Definitely. And I
I
know
had
a
my
lot
own
of,
Sunday school class at 16 too. Someone said I had their own
wait a
Sunday
minute.
school
Wait, say
class
it
at
again. I want to hear
17.
one more time.
Someone said they had their own Sunday school class at 17.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a young age to be teaching people about. That's just a lot, because I think when you're teaching Sunday school class, it's not just about biblical text, but also life lessons and helping people have a pathway to live. And when you just haven't lived enough life, or when you have such a narrow idea of life, you can't give that to people. And I know for me, as I realized I was queer at 19, so that's when I had to start deconstructing. I prayed the gay away first. I'm not going to pretend I was like, I'm queer and I accept myself. I had a whole process
Yeah,
with
you had a
that.
moment. Yeah.
It was my sister actually who saw me really wrestling with myself, and who I think had already gone through college, so she had I think unlearned a lot, and she told me, I see yourself fissuring yourself to belong somewhere. I see yourself trying to fracture yourself to belong somewhere. And if a space cannot hold all of you, that is just not the space for you. And
Woo!
I'm so
Say it again.
grateful
Say
that
it again.
the space cannot receive all of you is not the space for you. And I was so grateful my sister pulled me out of this idea that I needed to contort myself into a certain theology and help me realize the theology itself was broken, right? When a theology can't receive our humanity, it is not our humanity that is broken, it is a theology. And I think for so many of us, we have to, so the church always holds a mirror to us and says, you're mad at us, it's you. It is your deficiency. It is the ways you are unworthy. It is the way that you are born sinful. But it is never that. It has never been that. And so I think that's what kills me, is the way that I think, churches just, teach us to just lose all of who we are for a theology that could never receive us anyway, that could never see us anyway. And when I left my church and I started deconstructing around that time, actually, I was running track in college and I had a major injury. I really struggled with that, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
ended up reaching out to my old pastor. I was like, I'm going through this, I'm suffering. I hadn't told him about my queerness. And it was such an aha moment when I realized his theology was too small to even support me through an adverse event in my life. And I realized
Ooh.
I've been trying to work myself into a theology that can't even meet me at simple suffering, that can't even meet me at simple questioning, right? I was just told hard things happen and we have to trust that God has a purpose. But I thought, this is not giving me any concrete tools to deal with one of the most emotionally difficult things in my life, which is navigating changes within my body, within myself. And so it just helped me realize, like, not only is my theology queer phobic, but it's just more limited than I even understood, that it can't even engage with sadness, that it can't even engage with the
Oh
simple
my
ways life
God.
can
Oh my
be
God.
hard. And so for me,
Yeah.
in deconstructing my theology, I became such a healthier adult than living in that theology that actually couldn't even deal with the tumultuous parts of life. Like, it just had no answer. And that's crazy to me. It's crazy there's no answer.
Mm-hmm. A lot of that, right? A lot of like, you know, just there not being any answers and things like that.
I
And
guess.
just you being told, it's again, I feel like it goes back to that conversation we were having about suppression, right? You get told to like
Mm-hmm.
just pray about it, just seek God.
Yes.
We used to sing in the black church, just turn it over to the Lord and He'll work it out, right?
Mm.
That's the idea that we used to sing that song. Jesus will work it out. The problems that I
Mm.
had, I stopped worrying about it. And so
Mm.
like you literally are told to like you have this issue, and even though like you praying about it, you give it to God, um, but you still obviously are dealing with the harm of the trauma that you're experiencing, the grief or whatever the case may be that you're experiencing. Um, and it's suppression. It goes away for a little bit, you know. If you get, you know, something good happens to you, you credit it with God working it out, and um, but you never really get to process and sit with the experiences of your trauma and your grief.
Mm-hmm.
And that is just also just and just as problematic as like it's the issue. It's the issue of like you can't even process it, you can't sit with it, you can't hold on to it. You have to immediately get rid
Yes.
of it. But you that's not how it works. That's not how grief or sadness or trauma works. You can't just get rid of it.
Yes. Okay, I'm actually bummed because I have to leave this in a second because I have a lecture I'm giving on race, religion, and public policy in a second, actually. So this has actually formed my lecture. But before I go, I want to say, like, yes to the suppression of the self. I see so many comments resonating with that suppression. And it's just this, the reason I love gardening so much, I talk about gardening a lot on my page, is because it's helped me return to the body, it's helped me return to the self. But it's also helped me realize, like, the prosperity gospel makes us feel that when we do good for God, even though the Bible literally says, like, God sends rain on the just and unjust alike, there's so many passages about how we're all going to go through it because that's life. But prosperity gospel makes us feel like we will be insulated from harm. It makes us feel like, and the language is there. Like, my church used to always say, like, God gives us a hedge of protection. And when
Yeah.
you're a Christian, you walk around with angels around you. And I remember the first thing I feared when I started coming out was, I'm going to not be protected in the world. I'm not going to be spiritually protected. And the first
Mm.
few hard things I experienced after my sexuality, after I came into myself, it was hard not to equate them to my sexuality. It was hard not to be like, I got in a car crash, I'm gay. it was genuinely hard not to make these equivocations, because
Hmm.
when you've been taught, well, if you serve God with your whole heart, with everything, you're not getting in a car crash, but like Sally over there is, because Sally's messing with the devil, you know? And so like when you're taught that your theology will protect you and then bad things happen to you, it's hard not to equate that with your own moral failings, with this own idea that God doesn't love you, with this own idea that you stepped outside of it.
Wow.
And I think
Wow.
the gag is like, now in my as a black woman adult, I'm like, of course my white male pastors are systemically protected and they're calling that God. Of course they have economic access and they're calling that God. Of course they don't experience police brutality and they're calling that God. That's whiteness. And so I think there's ways that white
Wow.
people created whiteness, then called it God, and then said, if you don't experience God like me, it's because your faith is insufficient. But what you're experiencing is systemic privilege and telling me it's God, and then telling me that I suck because I'm not experiencing the same.
And
Those are my
calling
last
people
thoughts.
who have a different experience and who have to make difficult decisions to survive sinful
Yes.
and morally wrong and wicked. Like I
Yes.
literally had a conversation last night talking about this with Christy Burke and Felicia.
Oh, I love Christy Burke's work. I follow her. I love her work. I love
Yeah,
her work.
like
Yeah.
I had a conversation talking about this. Like that was one of the big things, moments of reckoning, is like dealing with the justice of God and talking about how black people are born. People who are, some people are born suffering, they die suffering,
Mm-hmm.
and they're told
Yes.
that that suffering is a result of their lack of faithfulness, and whatever the case may be. But white folks, they, again, whiteness, experience systemic privileges, experience all these different things, and they just attribute it to God. Like God has favored me, God has blessed me to have
Yeah.
these opportunities. When it's really like, sometimes it's nepotism. Sometimes it's just like knowing the right people. Sometimes it's having the connections and having the resources and having the generational knowledge about how to accumulate wealth and having generational wealth and all these different things. And
Yes.
like, so, but the person who is in poverty and who steals a loaf of bread from the store could burn in hell for eternity, because if he doesn't like confess that sin. No, that I was like, that's not just.
It's
It's
not
not just.
just. It's not just. And one of the first videos I saw from Christian Smith, which if y'all don't follow Christian, please do. His work is incredible. And the first video I saw from him, which is something that we actually talked about in one of my classes in grad school. And then after this, I got to end it, y'all, because I got to go for
Oh,
this conversation. So rich, I don't want to go, but I got to go. But after this, I have to end it. But
we can run it back. We can
he
run it
says,
back.
well, we're never going to run it back. This has been
Yeah,
such an awesome conversation. But
truly.
one of his first videos I saw was about, like, we're talking about end of days, like indigenous people didn't experience an apocalypse. Like African nations haven't experienced an apocalypse through colonialism. And so this idea that like there's a reckoning of God coming, like that reckoning has come, that experience of reckoning has already come for so many communities. Like America
Yeah.
was an indigenous land. Like we have a whole community has been obliterated in the name of white supremacy. I mean, African nations had to rebuild themselves because of the obliteration from the scramble of Africa. And so
Hmm.
also like how much theology is white centered, because the idea that there hasn't been apocalyptic suffering on this earth is a fallacy. And so I think
Woo!
that kills me
Talk
in
about
itself.
it.
Like people have suffered, have lost their whole communities, have lost their lives or ways of being. That is the second coming of Jesus for them. Like that, whatever that framing would have been, they have experienced it. And so I think white Christians don't want to hear that, because that means there's a lot more they have to think about with this lineage of faith and when God will come back, all that stuff. But that makes me mad. But I do have to let y'all
Yeah,
go
you
because
gotta
I
go.
have
Like
to go for
I
a
was just
second.
gonna say, like
But
you
before
gotta
I
get
go,
out of
I
here. I'm
want
gonna
to
talk
say
your ear
like
off from here.
this has been like such a joyful experience for me. Like Donnell, I think you're amazing. I'm so glad we had this
Thank you.
conversation.
Likewise.
So let me let you talk, and then we can end, because I don't want to end on just my note. But I want to say thank you for having me.
I'm gonna continue. I think I'm gonna stay on for a little
Hey, stay
bit
on.
just to
Okay.
wap up.
How do
So
I
like,
leave and make sure that it doesn't
you
exit
can just
yours?
hit your power button, and I'll still be on here. Yeah.
But it says if you'll disconnect. Oh, the other host. Okay, cool. But in
Hmm.
the live. Okay, perfect. Do I hit the end now? I don't want to end it.
It's not gonna
Is it
end the
gonna
whole
end?
live.
Oh,
It's gonna end
okay,
your.
perfect.
But again, if you don't follow Ciarra, please follow her. If you was here, you saw what I'm talking about. You see what I'm talking about now, right? You see it, right? Okay.
It's the synergy. It's the synergy. We gotta get vibe. We gotta get it anyway. Appreciate you, Donnell. Love the work you do.
Of
It's
course.
changing
Thank you.
lives.
Likewise. The
So
feeling's
proud to be a
mutual.
part of this conversation. And thanks, folks. And I'll see you later.
See ya. That was amazing. That's all I have to say. That was amazing. Wow. And I just want to say too, thank y'all for being open and sharing your stories in the comments. Like I know that that's a very like it's a very vulnerable thing to do, but I feel like it's there. This is a really safe space for people. Like I really try to create and curate a space that is people can share about their experiences and no one feels invalidated. So thank you all that shared your experiences with abuse, that shared your experiences with growing up in the church, that shared about your experiences with anything that you shared in the comments. Like I was reading and I was blown away, and I wish I could have stopped and like kind of engaged more, but y'all saw the conversation was just was hitting. It was just hitting. So we had to keep going. I'm sorry, y'all. I missed some of the comments, but just know I love and appreciate every single one of y'all who even commented something about anything that we talked about, because it's really, really appreciative.